Okay, so Parshas Vayigash. So we have, right, Yosef coming to Mitzrayim and the whole drama with his brothers. Vayigash means, and he approached, Vayigash Elav Yehuda, Yehuda approached Yosef. The Parsha opens up with this sort of contentious dialogue between Yosef and Yehuda, or Yehuda and Yosef. Yehuda approaching Yosef, not knowing who he is, and sort of saying, look, you've given us the runaround, we've done everything you said, we're like trying to do the right thing, and come on, like be reasonable, more or less. Anyway, story continues, and remember that obviously we're in the middle of a famine here, and it's effectively let's say at least a regional famine, if not a global famine. A regional famine, and Mitzrayim is the only place that has food because of Yosef's interpretation of Paro's dreams, and then Yosef's planning and implementation of that plan. And Paro basically put Yosef in charge, and when the Egyptians come to Paro and say like, hello, we're hungry, can we have some food? Paro says, go to Yosef, he's in charge, he set this up, he facilitated, he's managing it, go deal with him, whatever he says, that's what you're going to do. So they come to Yosef, and Yosef did a number of things. He gave them food, but he didn't just give the food for free, he made demands. And some of the things that he said, some of the demands that he made were he demanded that everyone get circumcised, get a bris milah. He, at some point, when eventually he made them all move around. Once the Egyptians, they had to buy the food, the grain from Yosef originally from the state. All of the food belonged to the state. They had to buy it from him. Eventually, their money ran out, and they were still hungry. Once their money ran out, he then made, a series of other demands. He demanded that everyone get circumcised in order to get grain. He made the people exchange their property and their land for grain. So basically, the state became the owner of the entirety of the land of Egypt, and everyone had to relinquish ownership over their land in exchange for food. And then once Yosef, as the representative of the state of Egypt, then owned all the land, that means no one had ownership over their home. He mixed everyone up and, made people move around the country. And part of what he was doing there part of his intent was that nobody should feel, or that people should feel less at home and comfortable, so that when his brothers come and end up settling in the land, they shouldn't be these strangers where everyone else knows each other and everybody, there's a community, everyone knows everyone, and then these strangers come and just settle. What he did was achieve a situation in which everyone's strangers, and that way his brothers are going to blend right in and no one's going to know the difference. They don't have to feel out of place. Now, when the words that Yosef said to the Egyptians were, Hey lachem zera. He said, take grain for yourselves. And when he said this, Hey lachem zera, take grain for yourselves, one of the things that's alluded to in these words, part of what he said to them was that they had to circumcise themselves in exchange for the grain. And the Midrash says that when Yosef said, Hey lachem zera, and he told them to circumcise themselves in exchange for the grain, he actually did something very wrong. That was something he should not have done. And as a result of what he did, what he did there actually precipitated the slavery in Egypt. And he, in a sense, I don't know if caused might be a bit of a strong word, but facilitated the slavery in Egypt by asking the Egyptians to circumcise themselves. So he did something very wrong, and actions have consequences. And the consequence, the outcome of Yosef asking the Egyptians to circumcise themselves was the slavery, which is a pretty big consequence, which means it was a pretty big mistake. Right? And when we say consequence, I use the word consequence here in the literal meaning of the word consequence, which is, it's the outcome, right? The word consequence can sometimes, for some people, becomes synonymous with punishment, but it doesn't actually mean punishment. Right? And why does the word consequence get confused for punishment? Because people will use the word consequence instead of punishment in trying to say, well, this is not me punishing you, this is the consequence of your actions. The outcome of your actions is this undesirable outcome, so you caused it with your actions. When people use the word consequence for what's actually a punishment, then, it works for 3 times, and then eventually the word consequence just becomes a substitute for punishment, as opposed to when the word consequence is used for a consequence as opposed to a punishment. Anyways, side point. So, consequences are not necessarily proportional, but a consequence is the derivative of an action, right? When an action causes an outcome, the outcome being the outcome of the action, there's going to be a connection between them. The bigger the mistake, the worse the outcome. The bigger or the better an action someone engages in, the greater the positive consequence. So this was a serious consequence, obviously, the slavery in Egypt, which means that the mistake that Yosef made here was a very serious mistake. What was so wrong? What did Yosef do? Yosef didn't just make up some random thing. Yosef told them to circumcise themselves. And he knows that circumcising is something that's valuable to Hashem. Hashem already told his, ancestor, great-great-great-grandfather, to circumcise himself, and that he and his household and offspring should be circumcised. So Yosef was like, oh, circumcising is a good thing. Let me get all the Egyptians to circumcise themselves. So the question is, first of all, what's wrong with it, period? And what's so wrong with it that the consequence, the outcome, is slavery of the entire Jewish people? And it was a brutal slavery. And what this all boils down to is the mistake, the essence of the mistake that Yosef made is that he just decided something of his own initiative. And this is something we're going to have to break down because it does become delicate, because we do have to use our minds. We do have to make decisions. Right? We're not supposed to just sit there and ask Hashem, ask a prophet, ask a rabbi, ask a mentor every time we lift a finger. We are supposed to take initiative. Our mind and our decision-making ability is part of what we are here to elevate. And we elevate it when we use it to try to do the right thing. So we are supposed to make decisions. We're supposed to try to figure things out. But there's a very big difference between using decision-making ability to make a decision about what seems to be the right or the best thing to do based on the available information, versus I'm going to decide to do something because I decide to do it. Right? The difference is that the first one of those two, the thing that is correct, is we are deciding, we are making a decision. What's the decision that we're making? In the first example, the decision that we're making is, what is, if we look at, and this is, let's say, right, and what's a word that one might use to describe a decision? You could say that was judicious decision. What does the word judicious mean? The judicial or judicious branch of government is judges. What's a judge's job? A judge's job is to judge. Right? And here, this, without getting political at all, or trying not to get political, in a sense, the mistake that Yosef made here, and I hadn't anticipated it going here specifically, but it leads here and it works, and this is actually, I think, a very good analogy, is that Yosef confused the roles of the judicial, he confused judiciousness and legislation. Right? There's a part of government whose job is to legislate, to make rules, to write laws. And then there's a branch of government whose job is judicial. It is judicial, to judge. To judge, to look at the law and to say, based on what the law, which was written by the legislators, based on what that law says, what does that therefore mean in this case? What are the implications? Is this the right thing to do or is it the wrong thing to do? A judge's job is not to write laws. A judge's job is to judge based on what the law says. Every one of us has to be a judge constantly. We have to be judicious. We have to evaluate. We have to calculate. Every second of our day, we are doing this. We are making decisions. Most of those decisions happen super quickly and subconsciously without us realizing. Everything we do is a decision that was made at some level within our brain. Everything we say is a decision that was made at some level in our nervous system. Right? Those are judgment calls. They are decisions. I will say this, I won't say this, I should do this, I shouldn't do this. Those are all judgment calls. And what are we judging? We are judging what seems to be either the right thing or the most valuable thing based on the available information and the circumstances, etc. Right? When we make a decision, we are deciding an outcome, we are deciding a course of action based on whatever is relevant to making that decision. We evaluate, right? Cost-benefit analysis. We look at the costs, we look at the benefits, we evaluate all the relevant factors, and then we make a decision based on those factors. That's something that we're all doing all day, every day, and we have to do and we should do. And the greater the extent to which we engage in judiciousness, in intentional decision-making, consciously, in our lives, the better our lives are going to go. The better the decisions we'll make, the better the outcomes will be, and the better life will be, the better life will go. Why? Why is it that if we make intentional decisions, things will be better? The reason that making intentional decisions will lead to a better life is because there are circumstances that exist and they're real. There are facts of life that exist and they are real. And the future of our lives, materially, spiritually, morally, ethically, etc., all of those things, what will happen in the future is going to be determined by a combination of our circumstances, facts of life, our thoughts, our words, and our actions. Right? We could say the same thing in different circumstances, it'll have different outcomes. Because the outcome is a combination of what we did or said or thought, and the circumstances in which we said or thought or did whatever it was, and all the relevant facts of life that connect and relate the two. So there are circumstances exist, facts of life exist, and they are going to have an impact on the outcomes of our actions. So it's a good idea to stop and to think, what are the circumstances? What are the relevant facts of life? With these in mind, what are my values? What are the things that I'm supposed to be doing? What are the outcomes I believe in? What are the values I believe in? With all of that in mind, what then does it make sense for me to do? And this is something that every one of us should be doing and must be doing. And every one of us actually is doing. The question is, are we doing it intentionally or is it just sort of happening? And the greater the extent to which we are doing this intentionally, the better things are going to be. Yes, a very relevant term. So, making decisions about what we should or shouldn't do based on an evaluation of the relevant circumstances and facts is imperative. That's very different to making a decision about, let's say, what the facts should or shouldn't be. Now, obviously, that doesn't make any sense because we can't decide what the facts should or shouldn't be unless we're journalists today. But the facts are what they are. Here, what Yosef did was, it's not our job to be legislators, to write rules, to write the laws. It's not our job to write. There's an expression that Elon Musk says. And it's personally, I find it to be incredibly profound. As maybe like silly and funny and childish as it sounds, in a sense, as it seems, it's actually incredibly profound, I think. And we have a very similar analog to this in Hayom Yom. I don't remember the exact words, but more or less the quote, the thing that he said was, or is, the only true laws are the laws of physics. All other laws are negotiable. Right? Now, an extension of that or an expression of that is there was someone actually here in Crown Heights many years ago who was known to have said, whether or not he said it, doesn't matter, he probably did, that there's no such thing as a place where you can't park. If there is space on the ground, it's a parking spot. Some parking spots are more expensive than others. Right? Which means legally you're not allowed to park there. It doesn't mean, right? The laws of gravity say that if you drop something within the reach of, the laws of physics say that if you drop something within the reach of planet Earth's gravity, it's going to fall towards the ground unless there's something stopping it. That law will always inevitably be true 100% of the time. It's not negotiable. And if you find a way around it, all you've done is actually worked within what the law says. Maybe you've found an unconventional form of resistance or something that's going to stop it, but there's no such thing as breaking that law. Obviously, there's Hashem and miracles, etc., but we're not talking about that. Right? Laws of physics are true laws. Every other law is negotiable. When it comes to facts, we don't get to make up laws. They are what they are. But then there is room, let's say in the context of a government, to legislate and to write laws. When it comes to what we should and should not do, we don't get to decide what we should and shouldn't do. Hashem decides what we should or shouldn't do. The laws of existence decide what we should or shouldn't do. Let me change what we should or shouldn't do. What is the right thing or what is the wrong thing? It's not up to us. We don't get to decide what is the right thing, what's the wrong thing. The decisions that we should be making, that we have to make, are based on what I know about what is right and what is wrong, about values, about purpose, and based on what I know of the circumstances and any other relevant piece of information. What then seems to me, based on my understanding, to be the correct thing that I should be saying, thinking, or doing right now? So that's the decision that we should be making. We don't get to decide what's right and wrong. We do get to and have to decide, based on what's true of right and wrong, what then seems to be the right thing for me to do.
What was the thing specifically that Yosef did on his own accord?
He told the Egyptians to circumcise themselves.
Was there not a law that like everything that he owns, like he's also like wasn't that included in some sort of pre
because they were servants,
they were servants, there was workers, and there's a law already, not from him, but there was like already this statute, so to speak, I guess, that like you circumcise your workers, like people that are underneath you, like your servants.
Well, they weren't part of his household.
Yeah, but isn't he in power? Like, isn't he in charge of the land and in charge of the food, and therefore, like, those extend under his.
Well, there's a very big difference between something being part of your household versus you having authority over something.
So this was
Yes.
And then he extended it to mean everybody that I'm in charge of.
He was like, well, I've got authority over you. Right? He didn't say, now you're part of my household. He was just like, look, I've got the leverage. I've got the food. You want the food? Go circumcise yourselves.
But I thought you asked him before to do it, and then he didn't have leverage, and then he asked him.
Okay, so
Yeah.
how does that change that?
No, it doesn't. I was just clarifying.
Right. So he was using his leverage to do something that there was no. Now, you could argue, right? Not even argue, suggest, whatever you want to call it, that, okay, but like what I just responded to what you said was, let's say that you suggested something and I explained why, in my view, it's not correct. Right? So had Yosef made the calculation that you made a mistake. Let's say worst case scenario. We all make mistakes in our calculations, right? Even the most intelligent and intentional and best meaning hypothetical, a person who hypothetically is, has the greatest IQ out of everyone and is the most intentional and the best meaning and all of those things, which doesn't exist, but if someone would be the hypothetical maximum of all of those things together, it is inevitable, as a matter of fact, that they are still going to make mistakes in the decisions that they make. So had that been what Yosef did, it's a mistake. Mistakes, like, okay, made a mistake. But there's a difference, very big difference between making a mistake in an intentional calculation or interpretation of, right, a judicial mistake, versus making the mistake of making something up. Right now, presumably, considering what we know about this, it wasn't the mistake that Yosef made wasn't that he made the mistake in calculation that you were just suggesting, because if he did, it would have been very different. It would have just been a mistake. Mistakes are mistakes, and they can have consequences. And sometimes those consequences might be really bad, but okay, you made a mistake. Right? But here what we're saying was it was much bigger than that. Yosef did something profoundly wrong. Now, the truth is there could be a mistake here also. Let's say that someone doesn't have clarity in the difference between, being judicious versus making things up. And then they think that they're being judicious, but they're really making something up and they're not clear on the difference between them. That could be a mistake too, because they mean well and they just don't realize, right? That could also be a mistake. But it's a much bigger mistake, right? Now, and presumably, we have no reason to believe that Yosef didn't mean well when he was doing this. But it was a catastrophic mistake. And it was the reason that it was a catastrophic mistake was because he made a mistake in something fundamental. Right? And let's say, for example, when there are conversations about this in this country. And again, I don't want to get into specifics, and it could go both ways. That's not the point. Right? But there is a very real conversation, at least that could potentially happen, let's say. Right? Where someone would come along and say, hang on a second, there was a court case about something, the judge made a ruling, but the judge's ruling was not a judgment of existing legislation. This judge made up a law that they think should be the case and ruled based on a decision they've made of their own initiative, not an interpretation of the law. That's not a judge's job, right? And that's a catastrophic mistake. If every judge just starts ruling cases based on the way they think things should be instead of interpreting the laws as they are, this whole country would fall apart in a second. Right? There has to, because there's a fundamental difference between making rules and interpreting the rules and making judgments based on the rules. Right? They're completely different things. And confusing the two is a fundamental error, and the outcomes of that can be and would realistically be catastrophic. And that's what happened here. Yes, but there is a system in place for how that's supposed to work. There are legislators, their job is to write the laws. And there's a system for how it works, and they have to have a majority, etc., etc. There's a system for how it works. Is it perfect? No. Is it pretty good, relatively speaking, at least hypothetically in the way it's supposed to work? Yes. If we could get rid of all the corruption, that would be amazing. Right? But there's a system in place for that. And then there is a system in place for judging specific cases based on what the laws say. Right? You can't have Congress could not judge every court case in the country. Right? Even every court case in the country that's about federal law wouldn't make any sense. It doesn't work. Right? And if every judge just decides what they think the law should be, that would also be a catastrophe. There are representatives of the people who write laws, write legislation based on what they think or things should be as a representative of the people that they represent, hypothetically. And they make the laws. And once those laws are written and put in place by the representatives of the people who are there to represent the people in writing laws, then technically anyone who has a legally clear and sharp mind should be able to interpret the laws and apply them. And then you could have an infinite number of judges who look at the laws, interpret the laws, and apply them. Right? So that, yes, the laws are made by someone, and that's the difference here between obviously the government and Hashem. But writing laws and making and interpreting and judging laws are completely separate things. And that's why the government in this country is set up specifically that they're separate and that they should not interact with each other. And what Yosef did here was confuse the two. It was like, oh, well, I've always got to make decisions about what's the right and wrong thing to do. He was like, you know what? I think this would be a really good idea. Why? Because I decided.
They took the law of no meat with milk, and then they're like, okay, now that includes chicken too, even technically it doesn't have chicken. You're saying that there's a court of law, there's procedures to go about making extending things to build fences and do stuff like that. But he's taking this this law, it's a law, right? Like everyone in your household that's under you, your servants, must be circumcised as well. He's taking that, and it's not a mistake, but he's intentionally expanding it to be wherever he has that leverage to extend it to Egypt, even though he's ruling over it and he's in a position of power, but technically they're not under his household.
Okay, good. So let's come back to the Chachamim and what they do versus what they don't do, right? Let's look at this distinction. The Torah tells us that we have to listen to the Chachamim, right? And the Chachamim's, part of the Chachamim's job is to, right? It says in Mishnah Beis of Pirkei Avos, va'asu siyag laTorah, to make a fence around the Torah, right? So in doing so, the Chachamim's job is to judge, to be judicious, to look at the laws. What does the Torah tell us? Let's look at reality, at human nature, at life and how life goes, and then see what are things that it would be a good idea to institute to protect what the Torah says. That is their job, and they are supposed to do that. There's also a scriptural prohibition in Isur D'Oraisa to add to mitzvahs. Right? So to come along and add to a mitzvah, add something. Now there are two parts to this. Number one is if it's an addition rather than a protection, and number two is even if, let's say that the Chachamim would come along and say, or someone would come along and say, you know what? You're not allowed to eat meat and milk together even if they're not cooked together, right? The Isur D'Oraisa is only if they're cooked. It's to cook meat and milk together, to eat meat and milk that have been cooked together, or to benefit from meat and milk that have been cooked together. If they were technically mid'oraisa, if you make a cheeseburger, but you only put the cheese on the burger once they've both cooled off below cooking temperature, technically it's not also d'oraisa. Right? Now the Chachamim come along and are like, whoa. There's zero chance that if you're allowed to make a cheeseburger, as long as you check the internal temperature of the meat and of the cheese and make sure there's no way it could cook, if that's allowed, 100% matter of fact, people are going to be making cheeseburgers that are over that temperature and there's going to be cooking. So none of that. right? That's very different to coming along and saying, you know what? You're also not allowed to have a cheeseburger even if it's below cooking temperature midaraisa. That's just a lie. That's not true. You're adding something to the Torah that's not part of Torah. Right? So even something that the Chachamim do say, if it's done in the wrong way, if someone would come along and say, we're going to add this, you don't get to add to the mitzvahs. It says in the Torah, you shall not add to the mitzvahs. That doesn't mean you shall not implement strategic
Measures of protection?
yes, excellent. To minimize the likelihood of something going wrong. Right? And the Chachamim are supposed to do that. And that is their job. Right? So here, let's say, what Yosef did was not extend something as a protection. Right? Had Yosef said, you know what, and this is feasible, right? And this is a very feasible mistake, let's say. And it would have still been a mistake, let's say, but whatever. Yosef would have said, you know what, like this bris and the household and all of that, and you know what, like, I have such an extreme degree of authority over these people, it kind of almost feels like they're my household, and I feel like if I don't make them get circumcised, that might transfer over to me forgetting to get my own household circumcised. That, if that was what he did, that would have been an example of the Chachamim making a siyag, making a fence, a measure of protection. Now, I would say that, how do we know that that's not what he did? Because we know that it was wrong, so obviously that's not what he did. Now, that might still have been a mistake if it wasn't a valid measure of protection, but it would have been a much more, let's say, acceptable variety of mistake, because we're inevitably going to make mistakes at that level sometimes. So, right, so that a measure of protection is very different to making something up. And that's what Yosef did here. Yosef said, oh, Hashem said to do that in this situation. That means this is a good thing. So I'm going to say to do it in that situation too. Right? It's like imagine someone comes into someone's house and I don't know, they've never heard of pain medication before. And they walk into someone's house and they see the person take a jar out of the closet and open it up and take out a couple pills and swallow them, maybe with some water. And they say, what's that? And they're like, well, I've got a headache. I'm in a lot of pain. I'm going to take this. It's going to make me feel better. And then the person says, oh, cool, that's interesting, it makes you feel better. And then the next morning they wake up and maybe they're feeling really down, they're feeling in a bad mood, whatever it is, and then they're like, oh, when you don't feel good, that stuff makes you feel better, I'm going to go take some Tylenol. It's like, no, it doesn't work that way. The fact that this thing had this outcome in that circumstance doesn't mean that thing's going to transfer that, depending on how much we abstract our description of what the outcome was. Anytime that someone wants to feel better, just take Tylenol. It doesn't work that way. Right? So Yosef, there was a mitzvah to implement bris milah in a certain circumstance. Yosef was like, oh, that means bris milah equals good thing. Let's just do it here too. Right? That was the mistake that he made. And it was a catastrophic mistake, and it resulted in the slavery of the entire Jewish people in Egypt.
Oh, I have another question about that. Like, remember, like, whenever his brothers threw him in the pit, and then they decided to sell him to slavery and not kill him, and all of that. They saw this element in him, like they could see, but they didn't know what it was. Like they saw that he was kind of
doing his own thing.
Like doing his own thing, and they were like they, in some level, not that their actions are justified, but that it's like this was a motivator because they saw this in him. They saw this quality in Yosef.
Is this a question?
Yeah, is this what it was pointing to? Like this.
I haven't seen anywhere explicitly said yes or no, but it makes a lot of sense, right? And the fact is that Yosef was very different, right? And look, let's imagine in reality, right? The reality is, sometimes you'll have people be like, oh my goodness, that person's like off the reservation. They're just completely like, don't follow any conventions. The way they do things makes no sense. They're just completely crazy. And then you'll have someone else who will come along and say, you know what, like let's just take a minute to appreciate some of the things they do that are out of the box and creative and are actually so positive and so valuable and so beneficial, right? Reality is it's not necessarily either or. It's not like which one of them's right, which one of them's wrong. It's like in reality, most of the time, it's going to be a mix of both, right? And the more creative a person is and the less a person values or cares about or respects convention, let's say, which would be a way of saying more or less is extremely creative, generally speaking, that is going to come with some costs and it's going to potentially produce some very substantial benefits. Benefits that a very, conventionally conservative person is never going to have. And there are also likely going to be costs that they're not going to have, right? So Yosef was a person who was creative and out of the box, etc., and all of these things. And he was completely different to his brothers and his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather, like completely different. And there were some incredibly valuable things that happened as a result. And, let's say that looking at it from a very just human experience perspective, that tends to come with some costs too, right? So it does make sense to say that they're all related. To what extent we define one thing as being its own thing versus separate or just part of this general, personality type or character, right? It makes sense that, there was this creative side he had, which means that he has the ability to do things positively that a person who's more tightly bound by convention will never get to. It also means that he's more likely to make mistakes and to err and to veer off in ways that are not necessarily positive, right? So I think it makes a lot of sense and it's reasonable to say that they saw that and it was just like, well, this is too dangerous. Like, well, this person's like way too creative. And does that creativity relate to this? I think it's reasonable to say at least at some level, yes. Does that answer? Okay. So now, there's a way in which the Frierdiker Rebbe relates this to something that is very important for us to keep in mind. And this is because, we have, and something that we know, under the Rebbe's leadership, we have it to an extreme degree, but this was something that was, the Frierdiker Rebbe really sort of already created this revolution, and the Rebbe sort of revolutionized it to a whole new level. But the idea of going out and spreading Torah and mitzvahs and really getting out there and not just keeping to ourselves, the Frierdiker Rebbe had students, people he sent out to go and spread Torah and mitzvahs and make mikvahs in the Soviet Union to risk their lives, and many of them actually did lose their lives. Like, this idea of getting out there and spreading Torah, mitzvahs, and teaching, it's not the Rebbe's novel idea, right? But at the same time as the Frierdiker Rebbe, very strongly encouraged and pushed his followers to be, let's say, somewhat creative, get out of the box, break out of the mold, go out, teach, spread, share. It's also extremely important, right, that the more creative a person is, and this is going to come back to just, again, practically thinking about it in the context of a regular human experience. A person who is very conservative by nature is not going to need to implement, rules in the same way that someone who's extremely creative does. Because they're just conservative by nature, they just do the thing that they're supposed to do, they do the conventional thing, they do what everyone does. It's like, what do they need and they don't need to add any boundaries on top of that because they're not going anywhere near the boundaries that already exist. Right? When you have someone who's very, very creative, ideally, right, in the perfect situation where we would say, look, this person's creative by nature, creativity can be extremely positive, extremely valuable, it can lead to very, very valuable outcomes that are never going to happen without creativity. But there's also a very real risk here, so let's try to figure out some guidelines we can put in place to contain the creativity, not to stifle the creativity, but to protect it from causing catastrophic damage. Right? And so the Frierdiker Rebbe, because there were people who, anyone who's just being a Torah mitzvahs Jew by the book and is not, let's say, outgoing and looking to sort of be novel and creative in terms of getting out there and sharing and teaching with people that one wouldn't ever have thought before the Frierdiker Rebbe to really get out there and share with and teach. The person who's not doing that doesn't even need to have this conversation. The person who is doing that then needs to have the conversation. Okay, so I am prepared to do things that are unconventional. I'm prepared to do things that no conventional Torah observant Jew for 2,000 years, for 3,000 years has ever done before. Okay, so I've got to make sure that I have clarity between being unconventional versus doing something negative. What's the distinction? We need to have a very clear, and it has to be clear because if it's not clear, we're going to end up making big mistakes. We need a very clear, defining line or boundary that distinguishes between that which is positive and correct and true and creative and out of the box versus that which is incorrect and wrong. Now, if we're not just following convention and tradition as a metric for what's right and wrong, what is the metric for what's right and wrong? Now, the truth is that shouldn't actually be a question. The answer to this is very simple and super basic. In reality, it can become complex, let's say, right? And the answer is, what does Torah say? If Torah says you have to do something, then you have to do it. It's that simple. Right? The laws of Torah, and this is what I was alluding to, and I forgot to bring it back when I was talking about Elon Musk and his statement. The laws of, if Torah says something is right, then it's right, period. If Torah says something's wrong, then it's wrong, period. You can be as creative as you want, and a person can be creative and take acid and do all the things and have maximum possible creativity. It doesn't change right and wrong. They're not going to change the laws of gravity, and they're not going to change what's right and wrong. If Torah says it's right, it's right. If Torah says it's wrong, it's wrong. Now, within Torah, right, things do get complex. And sometimes we could have a question, well, this is the law. We know that this is also a priority and there's another law and I'm not sure how to reconcile the two. You know what? Then you go and ask a Rav. You go and ask a mentor, a teacher, or someone. You seek guidance for someone who has a greater expertise in judging, in interpreting, understanding the laws, and then translating that to a decision, to a behavior in a set of circumstances. But if Torah says something's an obligation, then it's an obligation. If Torah says something's prohibited, it's prohibited. We don't get to be creative at the expense of what Torah says. We do get to, and should, if we're that kind of person, and everyone should to some degree, but obviously it's going to vary a lot, be creative in terms of not being held back and stifled by man-made conventions when they're not based on Torah saying what's right and wrong. Now, it can get difficult because a person who's all about, let me get out there and teach and share and bring people closer to Torah. And then, there are some things where everyone will say, well, this is the minhag and this is the way we do it and this is convention. And you know what? It would be the right thing. And if we would go to our local shul and do things differently, it would be the wrong thing to do. But it's not a halacha. Torah, Shulchan Aruch doesn't say, you're not allowed to do this. This is the accepted custom for good reason. So to go to the local shul and do it differently would be wrong. But to be in an environment where there are people who just found out yesterday that they're Jewish and they don't have any experience with Torah and mitzvahs, and we're going to get them to keep Shabbos or to keep kosher or to put on tefillin or to light Shabbos candles or to learn Aleph Beis, to learn Torah, by not imposing on them something that's a convention and a custom in a particular community or for everyone, but it's not an obligation. Maybe it might be the right thing to not follow the convention when relaxing on the convention is going to allow an actual mitzvah to be kept, a person to come closer to Torah, right? And if we look at the words that Hillel says in Pirkei Avos, he says, "Hevem Talmidav Shel Aaron, be from the students of Aaron, Ohev Shalom v'Rodav Shalom, love peace, pursue peace, Ohev Esabrias, love everyone, u'makarvan la Torah, and bring them closer to Torah." It doesn't say bring the Torah closer to them. Because if you bring the Torah closer to them, it's actually not Torah anymore. Torah is what it is. It doesn't change. Our job is to bring people closer to Torah. Now, can it get complex in terms of, okay, well, is this called changing the Torah, or is this called not adding to Torah and therefore let go of that, relax, and allow them to come closer, therefore, to the fundamentals? For a lot of people, it's not always so clear exactly which of the two it is. And you know what? That's why we have people to ask. What Yosef did was come up with a new idea. And to come up with new things that Torah doesn't say, that is a recipe for disaster. Right? And someone once asked the Frierdiker Rebbe, because there was a conversation that was at a conference of Rabbonim, of real big Rabbonim, and they were talking about, spreading Torah and mitzvahs and teaching people, and there are so many people who, need... It's like, if there is a fire raging, and this fire is a lack of knowledge of Jewishness, of Jewish identity, of Torah, of mitzvahs, a lack of understanding and appreciation, and a lack of observance, and this is a fire raging, if you have a massive fire to put out, and you've got, or let's say there's a fire somewhere, and you've got a massive bucket of water, and it's enough water to put out the bucket, you don't stop and ask yourself, has this water been distilled 2 times or 3 times? Or, oh my goodness, I think there might be a bug in the water. Hello, there's a fire, and there's water. Pour the water on the fire. You don't start wondering what level of quality the water is. Okay, so they're not keeping it perfectly. You're bringing someone closer to Torah mitzvahs. So you compromise on this halacha, you compromise on that halacha, you're bringing them closer to Torah mitzvahs. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says, yeah, the metaphor is valid, but it's not valid as a metaphor for this. What's the problem? The problem is, if you have a fire and someone says, oh my goodness, look, I've got a bucket of water, let me pour it on. And you say, hang on a second, let me just check the water. And the person says, what do you want to check for? Who cares if it's distilled or not, or if it's a little bit dirty? There's a fire, and the person says, well, I don't care about that, but I just want to check and smell it and make sure it's not kerosene. Because there was a bucket of water and a bucket of kerosene, and if you take the kerosene and say, I don't care if it's dirty, and you pour it on, you're not putting out the fire, you're making things 1,000 times worse. Right? If we make things up, if we say, oh, you know what? It's fine, we don't have to worry about that because we're bringing someone closer to Torah mitzvahs, let's just ignore that or let that go. And that's not something that Torah says we can let go of, we made it up. It's not dirty water, it's kerosene. We're not bringing them closer to Torah. We're bringing them closer to something that resembles Torah but isn't. Kerosene resembles water but isn't. Pour water on a fire, it goes out. You pour kerosene on a fire, it gets bigger. Very simple. Bring someone closer to Torah, and in doing so, loosen up, relax on things that you're allowed to relax on and loosen up. Excellent. Water. You're giving water to someone who's dying of thirst. Is the water the best water? No. You know what? Still going to rehydrate them. They'll be fine. If they're about to die of dehydration, give them the water. You don't say, oh, they're about to die of dehydration, let me give them kerosene because it looks like water. No, you're not helping. Right? And so this is the mistake that Yosef made, and the mistake that we need to make sure not to make. Because as when Yosef made the mistake, with good intentions, his intention was, bris milah is a good thing. Hashem told me, my great-grandfather, we should have bris milah. Our household should have bris milah. It's a good thing. It's a holy thing.
But they're not Jews. Why do they need it?
Originally, Avraham Avinu had to circumcise not just Jews, but his whole household. And even if not, that just makes the mistake even bigger. Right? Yosef was like, well, circumcision's a good thing. Let's get everybody to circumcise themselves. It's a good question. Mashiach should come today and you could ask him.
Of all the things he could have told them to do.
I mean, it was a fundamental thing. It was a covenant, right? It's bris milah, so. But, right, and that's and when Yosef made this mistake, right, inherently bris milah is not a bad thing. But the fact that he made it up is very bad, and the outcome was catastrophic. It was the whole slavery in Egypt. It might seem like I'm doing a good thing because, yeah, it's not technically right, but like under the circumstances, it's a good idea to do it. Might seem like a small thing, but the outcome can be catastrophic, like pouring kerosene on the fire instead of water. Have a good week.